until
All right, I think we're ready to call this session to order, please, everybody.
on Thursday.
And once again, welcome to all the panel members, public audience, media in attendance. As always, we encourage members of the public to attend and observe. This part of today's session will be audio live streamed to the panel website at childinterventionpanel.alberta.ca. And we also ask people joining us who wish to provide input into what the panel is discussing to please complete the panel submission form handed out today, or to complete the Phase 2 online discussion guide on the panel's website, or send an email to cipanel.questions@gov.ab.ca. So I would now like to invite Eldon Block, Diane Thompson, and Norm Welch from Children's Services to introduce themselves and present on the standards of practice.
Good morning. My name is Eldon Block. I'm the Executive Director for the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act. I think I've met a good number of you before. I have the privilege of being here to introduce, and I'll get them to introduce themselves a little bit more, but Norm and Diane, they are the leads in the standards and monitoring area. I'll highlight, and actually if you want to go to the first slide, just before we go through there, just to give you an idea of what they're going to cover today, and that is a history and the role of the standards. How standards are one part of a quality assurance and continuous improvement approach. We'll talk about the standards results, and there'll be a key focus on the measure that we're worried about in terms of contact and recording that contact. We'll then talk about looking forward. What are we going to do to ensure there is support and improvement in that measure. So with that, I'll hand it off.
Good morning, panel. Good morning, panel members. My name's Norm Welch. I'm a senior manager with the Office of the Statutory Director, and with a primary focus of quality assurance and working in the standards and monitoring area.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today to meet with you all in traditional Treaty 6 territory. My name is Diane Thompson, and I'm with the Practice Measurement Unit, the primary focus being on child intervention standards and data collection. And with that, I think I'll launch right in. So I'm here to talk to you today, like I said, about the child intervention standards. And as you know, as you've seen in some of your pre-reading, the standards are only one piece of quality assurance. Today, we're going to touch on only 3 areas. With our focus mainly on the standards, we're also going to touch on the service delivery accountability framework and the timely and accurate program information strategy. It's important to know that standards are the measures of minimum expectations that are aligned with policy and based in legislation. Aligned with legislation and based in policy. The child intervention standards have been around since 2001, and the requirement for the child intervention standards was originally outlined in the Child and Family Services Authorities Act and associated regulations, as well as in the delegated First Nation agency agreements. The original set of standards were provincial safety standards, and they covered a variety of program areas, including child intervention, but could also cover areas such as family day homes and whatnot. There were 19 standards at that time. The Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act was introduced in 2004, and in 2006, the standards were updated to be the child intervention standards. So solely focused on the child intervention program, and with 16 standards at that time. In 2006-07, the Office of the Auditor General did a systems audit on the standards and child intervention. And to follow up on the commentary in that report, the standards were revised in 2007 and updated to be 16 standards, but focusing on the implementation of the casework practice model at that time. In 2010, continuing on with the commentary from the OAG, as well as to reflect the ministry's move toward the focus on outcomes for children, the standards were revised. They were revised based on what we could reasonably believe would lead to good outcomes for children. And they were focused on what the child's experience would be with child intervention. In 2014, this Child and Family Services Authority Act expires, and the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act amendments come in that make the reporting of the standards public now through the Council for Quality Assurance annual report. The standards are being revised in 2017 to reflect practice changes with a focus on improving the quality of services to children and families. So we're moving the standards from what in the past has been very process-oriented measures. We've moved them over time into more outcome-focused measures, and we're going to continue to move those into easily understood measures that reflect current practice and, again, focus on improving quality to children and families. And with that change in 2017, we're going to move from the manual process that we're going to talk about coming up to a more electronic-driven set of measures. If I miss anything you deem important, you're going to interrupt, right? Okay. So the process for information gathering for the standards and results reporting. This is a rigorous process, and it requires adherence to established processes. This is how we ensure that the data and the information we're gathering is reliable and accurate and consistent over time for reporting on the standards. Gives us confidence in the data. Selected provincial service delivery staff are trained to do reviews in their service delivery area. The practice measurement unit in the Office of the Statutory Director does the reviews for the delegated First Nation agencies. And we do them simply to support the DFNAs as they're often have struggles with resourcing. And their focus should be on frontline service delivery, and we can pick up this administrative piece of the process. Standards are gathered through a manual review of the narrative information on the child's file, and this is recorded information that's in the electronic information system as well as the physical paper file for the child. The review covers a period of 1 year prior to the date of the review, up to 1 year, depending on the continuous involvement with that child. The way the standards are currently written and the measurement period of up to 1 year, it makes some of the measures an all-or-one measurement, and we'll talk about that more as we get into the actual results. But it can mean that when a child's involved for 12 months, that there's one exception during that time, and as a result, they get a no to that standard measurement. So it's an all or nothing. But given that this reflects then the experience of that child over that course of time with the child intervention system. So the drawbacks to that methodology is that we can't go back and fix things, and we can't go back and correct things for the child. So, and some of that is what's contributing to the change in the child intervention standards approach. Some of the advantages, though, is that we get to see the experience of the child over that period of time with the child intervention system. It's labor intensive, so a sampling process is used. So based on the size of the service delivery area, and size I mean in terms of the active files that each service delivery area has, a sample of files are reviewed. And we review 3 different files/activity types. So intakes, safety phase, which are investigations, and ongoing files. We randomly generate a list of files from the information system to review, and it's based on the sampling methodologies that gives us confidence, a 90% confidence value in our results, with a margin of error plus or minus 10%, 18 times out of 20. As each file reviewer then goes into the field and reviews a file, they provide the information directly back to the caseworker and supervisor at the time of the file review. So there's a data collection tool that's used. It includes a number of measures that the file is read against, and responses are made into that data collection tool. Then this information is provided to the caseworker and the supervisor so that they can check it to see that the information is accurate as recorded, and it opens up the process to be transparent and available to the workers. We expect that the reviewers sit with the workers and explain the process to them as it happens. At the end of, reporting is provided twice a year to the statutory director. A preliminary report is completed following completion of half of the data collection cycle, and a final report is provided. The reports are provided to the statutory director as well as the service delivery directors. The final report is provided to the statutory director, and he then provides it to the service delivery directors and the Assistant Deputy Minister of Child Intervention. It's warm in here. So as I talked about briefly before, the standards information gathering process is intended to be a learning opportunity for staff. We've worked hard over the years to make this a process that engages workers and involves them in the data collection on their files so that they can learn from what we're doing. So staff are able to sit with reviewers to review files. Sometimes that's not always possible. Things are quite busy for workers in the field. But it's also another face they see on a regular basis. So they may ask the reviewers that are in their offices for feedback on new initiatives or implementation or how to enter information in the information system. And all that's built on the relationship that happens by having those reviewers in those offices. This manual review process, although it's labor intensive, provides a valuable opportunity to gather information that we can't gather in other ways from, as I said, from the narrative information on the file. That's and we have a number. Can you flip to the next slide, please? We have a number of ways it's used. So we'll oftentimes we'll add extra information to the standards review process. So in addition to the measures that contribute to the reporting of the standards, we may add extra items that gather information for new initiatives and whatnot. This year we've included some that reflect a response to the Auditor General's report of 2014 that talks about case planning. So we've added some measures related to case planning to the review tool. Also, the process, we've come a long way with the rigorous process that we've established to gather this reliable and useful practice information. So sometimes the process is used for completely specialized review, where we may review, again, new initiatives or areas of interest for service delivery directors. As I spoke about before, sometimes there are items we add to the review in addition to the standards measures, and some of those that we've added for the last couple of years have been based in research, but also based in the reports that arise from incidents of death or serious incidents where we see gaps in service. So we've included some of those measures right in the data collection tool. And the analysis and exploration of those measures then led us into the risk review process, which Norm's going to talk about.
So 2 years ago, we introduced the risk review process. And what we did is we added a number of criteria to the data collection tool that the practice activity is measured against. And these activities that were added, or these criteria that were added, were medical, issues with school, grief and loss, and multiple case managers, suicide, and AWOL. These criteria are based upon a number of different pieces of information that we've gathered over time, some of that being from our own experience in reviewing serious injury and death, as well as with some other jurisdictions and what other academic literature was telling us about what's happening in other parts of the world. So as the reviewer goes out and looks at the file, if they identify one of these criteria and cannot identify any mitigating factors, then the file is identified as a risk file. And these files this information is then provided back to the service delivery directors throughout the province for their follow-up and response. Then what we do is we go back out again and we look at the same file for a second time to ensure that there has been action and activity taken to mitigate the identified risk. So we first identify the risk, then we provide the information to the service delivery directors, then we follow up to close the loop to ensure that appropriate action has been taken and that any risks that are identified on the file have been mitigated. During the cycle of file reviews that are followed, what we do is we confirm that these things are happening, and then we remove the file from the risk review list and provide that information also back to the service delivery director. Right now we'll turn it back over to Diane, who will talk about who uses this information. So
the information gathered from the file review was used by a number of areas, and I'm going to quickly touch on this because we're not the expertise in how the information is used. We gather the information and provide it for use. So here's a kind of a sprinkling of how the information is used. As I touched on before, the caseworker and supervisor get the immediate feedback on any of the child's files that have been reviewed for their caseload. The statutory director is provided the results from the review to use in the service delivery accountabilities. Service delivery directors and delegated First Nation agency board of directors often use the information to assess how their agency is doing in terms of service delivery. And the Council for Quality Assurance uses the information to report publicly in their annual report. Again, this is not a comprehensive list of how these different areas use it, but some examples. Now I'm going to talk about results. So standard 1 is emergency response and safety. And I believe we've provided in the pre-reading some plain language standards descriptions for you guys. So standard 1 is emergency response and safety. So, well, before I start, some of the results that you'll see here may look like differences, but based on our sampling methodology, they may not be statistically significant differences. Standard 1, we review all file types for this. So intakes, investigations, safety phases. We look for incidents where a child's immediate safety is at risk and that the worker responded urgently to address that risk. So this is the basics. So you talk about, caseworkers will tell you that this is the heart and soul of their job. They go out, ensure children are safe, and then document it in their case notes. You'll see it's not 100% here, but before we leave the work site, we've also confirmed that if the response wasn't immediate, we've confirmed that the child was safe, that they're currently safe wherever they are. Standard 2 is about investigations and initial client contact. So the investigation phase of involvement is really about making an assessment to determine the need for intervention services and then what type of services the family may benefit from. So in order to make a determination, it's important that all necessary parties are contacted. Again, this standard measures looks at who the minimums are to make that assessment. So the requirement is that the child that has been identified as a child in need is interviewed face-to-face, that school-age children are interviewed separate and away from the family, that all other children living in the home are interviewed, and that both guardians are interviewed. These are critical to make an assessment of services. Standard 6 is about placement. These are for ongoing files. And as I talked about before, the standards currently look at the experience of the child. So this is not a separate sample of placements, but rather as a subsample of those children whose files we reviewed who were placed or in care during the time of the review. The first measure looks at licensed or accredited placements. So foster homes, group homes, residential treatment facilities are required to be licensed under the Residential Licensing Act. As well, any third-party provider is required to be accredited through an approved accrediting body. The next set of measures you'll see grouped together are for children that are placed in newly opened homes. So this home opened for the child. So when we open a home for a child, we require that there's an intervention record check, a criminal record check, that the environment in the home has been checked for safety, and that there is a visit prior to or at the time of placement. So these are for newly open homes. For children that have been placed in already open homes, so maybe the home was open for their sibling or it's someone the family knows that are already providing care, the worker is required to do their due diligence to ensure that there is a current criminal record check on file, that there's been an updated safety environment check in the last year, and that there's a home visit at the time the child is placed. The final measure in this standard deals with placement issues addressed. It's similar to the standard 1. Here we look at when you're reviewing the file, if there's any issues related to the child's placement, maybe placement stability, quality of care of the child in that home, that the worker is taking steps to address those issues. as soon as possible. Standard 5. Standard 5, cultural connectedness. We don't really view this one as a compliance measure. When we did the last revision of the standards, well, cultural connectedness, you can see, is a challenging thing to measure. And in the last revision of the standards in 2010, we had a number of conversations with our First Nation partners. And from those conversations, this standard was developed, and we recognize that it's only a start to where we need to be in cultural connectedness, but this is what we clearly heard from them. What we heard from them was when there is an Indigenous child, when they're living on their home reserve or with a relative or in a traditional home providing traditional types of approaches to caregiving, they view this as being culturally connected because the child is living their culture. Now, there are exceptions, as all nations view things differently, but for the most part, there's an agreement on this means a child is culturally connected. So you'll see that quite a few of the kids are connected in this way. Then for children that aren't in those types of placements, we look at or types of involvement, we look at whether they are involved in any cultural activities. And then, so there's a whole list of the types of cultural activities they may be. And again, we're not placing a judgment on what's a good cultural activity or not great one. We just gather the information about what's happening for that child. And then there's a small number of children that aren't connected to cultural activities. And some of those may be because they refused, but we recognize that we need to continue revisit that, or any reason why they might not be involved needs to be reviewed and considered going forward. Standard 3, planning for permanency. This is really about case planning for a child. And case planning is the fundamental kind of unit for service delivery. It's what's laid out as the plan that the caseworker and the family will work together to address the safety, well-being, and permanency for a child. This is reviewed again for ongoing files. So we require that the plan is collaborative in that all relevant parties are at the table and part of the plan, including the child and the guardian, if the guardian is still involved, and the caregiver, and or the caregiver, if the caregiver is involved. The plan not only needs to be collaborative, but it needs to be reviewed every 3 months on an ongoing basis. Standard 4, caseworker contact. This is an area we recognize needs improvement. This standard is made up of 7 practice measures that involve contact with the child, caregiver, and guardian. And this is reviewed for ongoing cases. Again, we need to have this regular ongoing contact in order to ensure or get a good sense of the child's safety, well-being, how the case plan is being implemented, and progress towards achieving the case plan goals. Contact with the child is required monthly. So there needs to be a monthly and then every 3-month face-to-face contact. The contacts the measures include a quality component. So it's not enough just to see your child and wave at them across the field or whatnot, but there needs to be a conversation about how things are going for that child to get a sense of, again, their safety, well-being, how things are going in school, get an understanding of what life's like for that child. We also require that contact with the caregiver, monthly and face-to-face, if they're involved with the caregiver, as well as guardians, if the guardians are involved with the child. You'll see the third measure speaks to caseworker actively engaged with the child. So this is actively engaged to build a relationship. The other measures speak to a monthly requirement or a face-to-face requirement every 3 months. And these are the measures we talked about before, that if you miss one, it's a no, you get a no. And so we had a lot of quality information that was just kind of not gathered and not reflected not reflective of the good work that is happening out there. So the third measure speaks to, regardless of the timelines, for all the contact that happens on the file, do you have a good sense that the caseworker actively engaged with that child to build a relationship? And now we're looking forward, and I'll turn it over to Eldon.
Thanks, Diane. So looking forward, I want to talk about some of the things that we are looking at doing and are doing in terms of specifically improving the results and supporting service delivery to improve the results in regards to the contact measure. So I'm going to talk about a little bit, just really briefly, about a service delivery accountability framework. And in that, what it was is back in April of 2015, and I meet regularly with all the service delivery directors, I talked with them about the importance of them supporting their teams, their frontline workers, to focus on the critical things. And it's the critical things that workers have talked about from the practice framework, and that is seeing kids. So it was about saying that we need to ensure that frontline staff are supported to, once they've had that contact, get it in the system. I truly believed, and I'll show you in a little bit, that contact was happening and it was being recorded, but it wasn't, or it was happening, it wasn't necessarily being recorded, and it wasn't being put in the system. The other thing that we're looking at is, and Diane talked about this in terms of the revision of standards, and that's aligning our standards up with the changes in practice that have happened, and then focusing on how can information technology, how can that assist frontline staff to get that information into our system so that it can be recorded and reported on. And in that, I'll talk about the timely and accurate program information we refer to as TAPIS. So going back to April of 2015, those discussions with service delivery directors saying this is critical. There's lots of essential work, but this is critical to support teams. And we were able to, okay, change the slide. With our information system, develop reports and monitoring that are as close to as real time as if you enter something today, that result will show up tomorrow. So unlike the standards where it's going out, looking at a file, you're looking back, the information system that we have right now and these results are immediate. So in April of 2015, when we pulled the report in terms of face-to-face contact with a child in the previous 90 days, the system told us that 40% of the kids that needed their contact recorded, it was completed in 40% for 40% of the children. Again, focus, giving this information to service delivery directors so they could access it, managers, supervisors. And what you'll see on the graph there is that focus, we now are consistently above 90%. And what that means is today, for example, we can go in the system and we know that of the children that need to have contact every 90 days, 90% have it recorded in the system. I'll go to the next slide. I'll touch on just very quickly in terms of, again, what we're looking at and the combination of what's needed to ensure that we can improve results. And what that is a real focus on strong leadership that's supporting of the front line to support them. We know they're seeing kids, but support them to get information into the system. Support for staff in terms of technology and administrative efficiencies, and having that real-time reporting so that if there is something that needs to be addressed, it can be done very quickly. So it needs to be responsible. And then also it's about ensuring that we have manageable caseload numbers for caseworkers. Thank you.
All right, that brings us to the end, and I've got some questions. All righty. I'll begin with Rick. So we're short of microphone, maybe. Do we have one down this way?
Okay, thank you. I got a couple quick questions. Now, on the page 16, where you go looking forward on the TAPIS results, April 2015 is the first data point. Is that when we first started measuring that, or was that a midpoint of some further measurement?
That was the first point.
All right. Okay. No, that kind of supports the maxim that what gets measured gets done, because apparently once it got measured, it went from 40 to 90% pretty darn quick and stayed there. So that's a good thing. Now, the other on the very first slide, the very first standard, it said document they responded urgently, and I think actually this morning what I heard talking to caseworkers and caseworker supervisors is that one of the most important things in their view is to, at the front end, to slow down and do it right, because you can only remove a child from their home the first time and then it's done, and then if whatever scarring takes place is there, or you can only leave them there once when they should be taken out and have damage done. So this isn't meant to be sarcastic, although it may sound like it. It says urgently, but it doesn't say correctly. So is there? I assume that you want it done correctly, but the measurement is just urgently. Are we pushing people to make faster decisions than they should properly be asked to make, at risk of them making mistakes, some of which will cause changes in the child or family's life that can't be really reversed 100%?
So this measure is really getting at, like what you heard this morning is what happens. We want to slow things down and do a better assessment. Sometimes when a child is in immediate danger, you don't have time to slow down. So it's not about those cases. It's not about every time that it's an urgent response. It's really about those critical, the type of cases where if it was a medical system, you'd be going to the emergency room in an ambulance. Those types of cases. So we expect that once that immediate risk is addressed, then there's the time to slow down and do the necessary assessment, or in those cases where it's not that urgent.
Okay. And I have one more, if you don't mind, Chair, then I'll pass it on. I know that we got to share the airtime here. Slide 12, cultural connectedness. And I guess it says it's not a compliance measure, but I think what we've heard from the beginning of this is Indigenous people of all the different kinds amount to 60 or 70% of all the kids in care, and keeping them connected to their culture is one of those things I think we've learned that helps the child to develop normally, to feel connected to their family, to their community. So my question is, and it's a real one, should it be a compliance measure? Just based on the fact that 2/3 of the kids or so in care are Indigenous, and they are not the only culturally diverse kids that we look after.
Yeah, this measure is part of the reason that we don't call it a compliance measure. Is when we start talking about culturally connected, that's a really tough concept to measure. So if we started to say, yes, these many kids are culturally connected, by whose lens? So that's why we moved to this type of measure, to really look at what's happening for them. By default, some of them are connected, but it's really about where their connection is to their community and how that's set up. So that's typically why we haven't talked about it as a compliance measure. Do we need to get better on that? For sure, and we're moving that way, especially in response to some of the commentary from the OAG report in 2014. But yeah, that's why it's that way as of now.
I have Greg, then Bruce, and Patty. Did I miss anybody? And we've got about 10 minutes, so keep that in mind. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. This should only take about 9. No, what I'm curious about is as I look at these various standards, I see a trend in the wrong direction. I see it trending down, and I just wonder if perhaps you could speak to that. I realize with the TAPIS process, seems to have trended at certain measures up. So that's just a general question. On slide 11, standard 6. In addition to the trend down in most, not quite all, but most areas over 2014 to 2015, I want to focus specifically on children placed in newly opened homes. criminal record checks and safety environment assessed. It looks like we have 11% of children placed in newly opened homes where there is no criminal record check, which is 5% fewer than the year previous. And we have 11% fewer of safety environment assessed, fully 16% of children placed in newly opened homes without a safety environment assessment. Now, just looking at this one slide, that's troubling to me. I'm just wondering if is it simply that it was not assessed, or is it that it was assessed but not recorded? Are there perhaps valid reasons for this to have occurred that I am not aware of? Just wondering if you could speak to those two things, please.
So some of the changes that you see, I touched on it previously, and this is not going to be a total response to this. The margin of error in the results of these measures are quite large when you get into a subpopulation of a sample. So, and this is some of the challenge that we face since they've gone public, is that it's hard to explain some of the subsampling and the margin of error that exists within that type of sampling. As for completed, so some of these, although they're not completed prior to the placement, they're often completed shortly after it, or bang bang, and they may already be on the file when we review it. It's just it didn't follow the exact timeline of being completed prior to.
And are there targets? I mean, is the target 100% in it for all of these measures, or is it, am I thinking of some of the other standards a little further along where some of the numbers are well below, the monthly contact kind of standards? I acknowledge you've addressed that in a different slide. Are there targets that we're striving for? Is every target 100%, or is there...
Well, I think we always have to aim for 100%, yeah. We haven't set official targets, but the aim is to always improve and move towards that 100%. There'll always be exceptions, so you'll never quite get there, but the aim is to be close to that target of 100%, yes.
Thank you.
Bruce, followed by Patty.
Can Patty go first? Yeah, okay. So one of the questions I'm interested in learning about is, how does the case file review get translated back to frontline staff? So do they understand the aggregate information, or do you also look at case level data for them? On your cases, you didn't respond to this, and this, and what was the rationale for it? Is that a learning process for frontline supervision, for example, or is it more about the aggregate learning that can happen? Is that clear? Yeah.
Okay, so as I spoke about, as part of the process, workers receive the feedback on their individual files. So as the data collection tool is completed, it's emailed to the caseworker with not only the actual completed data collection tool, but also a summary of the deficiencies related to the standards measures. So they can see instantly what's been gathered and what they may need to address. Or it gives them the opportunity to go in and say, hey, this is already on the file, you guys missed it, because, well, people make mistakes, and sometimes we miss things. So it opens up the process to be transparent in that manner. Service delivery directors, I can't speak for how they use the information aggregate. They're the ones that receive it as an aggregate for their service delivery area. We don't do profiles of worker caseloads. We've over the years, we've specifically avoided that in terms of we don't want this to be a punitive process. We've worked on it being a learning opportunity, moving towards that way. In the First Nation agencies, I know we do a lot of discussion with their staff, sitting around tables that look somewhat like this, talking about the results, helping them understand what they can do to improve, what it means in actual practice, and those types of things. So they receive both the aggregate and the case level information. Did that get to cover your question?
And is it possible to get a copy of the form that's used?
Yep.
Of the kind of
Yeah.
collected in one?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I've got Peter, then Maria, and David, and we have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. I just have a couple of process questions to begin with. A slide that listed what constitutes an emergency, I didn't notice multiple placement as part of that.
Oh, on the risk files?
Sorry, okay.
Yeah.
So on the risk file, you listed the factors. I was curious why multiple placement wasn't, or placement and stability. That's slide 7.
I don't think that, no, I don't. Never mind, I don't think. This wasn't a comprehensive list. It was just some examples of what we collect. Multiple placements are a factor in risk because it factors into the loss. When we talk about losses for the child, it can be their apprehension or it can be their multiple moves.
All right, so,
Yeah.
again, to Bruce's question, then the form would
Yeah,
probably
absolutely.
answer that. Okay. And if I understand the data correctly, so I may not, so feel free to tell me I'm not. The data is frequency versus outcome of an activity. That part's correct, yeah? Okay. And the definition of the frequency is fairly rigid. And so, for example, in response to Greg's question, you indicated that the criminal record might be the day after as opposed to the day of, and that makes it non-compliant.
Yes.
Okay. Why that rigidity then? Because what you're describing for us is data that is actually not really measuring success with the standard in a broad sense. You're describing to us measurement in a very rigid sense. And so when we come to Greg's question, for example, about those declines, you might be over-measuring decline, but we won't know that. So why the rigidity?
The rigidity has been there pretty much since the beginning of the standards in 2001. And it's about reliability of the data and consistency, as well as measuring what we require to be minimum. So once you step away from what's in the policy and based in the policy and the legislation, you have to then draw the line somewhere. So we've kept that line within what's in the policy and following the policy expectations. And that's where the rigidity comes from. We do have measures that exist within the tool that help us understand some of the things that happen outside of that. And but they don't get reported as part of the standards. We call them quality assurance measures. Also, with our revision to the standards, we hope to then use this process. The standards, the expectation is to move more electronically, but we would maintain this file review process to really get at the quality and the reality of what's happening. So moving away from the more rigid stuff, but getting into the more of the story.
And then just a very, very quick follow-up question. And this just as a result of sitting at a table this morning. I don't know how you would measure this, but it sort of speaks to me about the gap between this kind of data and a reality of practice, and I'm just curious how we close that. So one of the DFNA representatives was saying, you know, we have people on the reserve who don't have a criminal record, but they're the crack dealer, but you don't ask us. So they would pass the criminal record check, but if you asked us, we would tell you it's a very unsafe house. And so it's sort of that gap between what policy would say and what practice would say. How would we work? I'm just using it as an example, but how could we measure or improve around some of those data gaps? I know it's a tough question, but
That is a tough question, and it's really I'm weighing in way outside of the standards area now. That's kind of what the expectation is of practice. So, like, they're not limited to standards. The standards set out the requirements, the policy set out the requirements, but there's practitioner experience and expertise that need to get factored into how they practice and make determinations about safety of the child. They have that expertise and ability to draw that information into their assessment from their community.
So I've got still Maria and David, and we're out of time. We're scheduled to start our lunch break, and we do have a 12:30 meeting. Has any portion of your questions been covered, or do you still... Go ahead. Okay, then go ahead, Maria. Very, very quickly, please.
I just wanted more of a sense of quality. We're hearing process and reporting, but it's not clear to me, number one, if there's a consistent application of the standards across all the different parts, because I heard at the table today that there was very inconsistent application of standards in various parts of the province, not least the DFNAs, but even within regions, and how you're measuring that in relation to accreditation. How do these feed into accreditation?
Accreditation expert.
Is this part
The
of
short answer is no. They're very separate from accreditation. The accrediting bodies set their standards that they require agencies to follow and meet related to third-party service providers for child intervention. This is not part of that. This solely measures the child intervention practice and policy.
And what about the consistent application across the province?
I think that's some of what comes out through the measurement. Because they do have the ability to access their information for various service delivery areas, and the inconsistent application is what comes out in the measurement.
All right. We're going to break for lunch in the Boreal Forest room, and promptly at 12:30, we're going to move back into the community of practice in the other room, where we'll go back in camera. So please try to be prompt. Thank you.